I wasn't planning to tell you this. Not tonight. Not ever, really. But I can't stop thinking about it. Every time my phone buzzes now, my heart skips a beat. I don't know where to start, but I guess you need some context. My dad died 3 years ago. It wasn't sudden. He'd been sick for a long time, battling lung cancer that eventually spread everywhere. Watching him wither away was brutal. But at least I had time to say goodbye. We buried him in December, on one of those bitterly cold days where your breath hangs in the air like smoke. Dad was a big part of my life, even when he was dying. We'd talk every day, sometimes just short calls to check in, other times long conversations where he'd ramble about old stories or give me unsolicited advice. When he passed, I didn't just lose my father. I lost a piece of my routine, my anchor. 3 weeks ago, everything changed. I was at home scrolling mindlessly on my phone when it rang. The number flashed on the screen and my stomach dropped. It was his number. At first, I thought it was some kind of glitch. Maybe my phone had synced with an old contact, or maybe the number got reassigned to someone else. But the name popped up too. Dad. That's how I saved it years ago. I stared at the screen, frozen. I didn't answer. But that was just the beginning. I didn't answer the call. I couldn't. My hand hovered over the screen, but my body refused to move. Instead, I watched as the phone vibrated in my hand, the ringtone blaring like an alarm. The name Dad stared back at me until the call went to voicemail. The moment it stopped ringing, I set the phone down like it had burned me. I felt a tightness in my chest, like I'd been holding my breath for minutes. The rational part of my brain told me it had to be a mistake. Someone else must have gotten the number after his death. But why would they call me? Curiosity got the better of me, though, and I checked the voicemail. My thumb hovered over the play button for what felt like forever. Finally, I pressed it. "You have one new message," the automated voice said. Then, silence. For a second, I thought there was nothing there, but as I strained to hear, I realized there was something. A faint static, like an old TV tuned to a dead channel. The longer I listened, the more I thought I could make out something. Faint whispers, maybe. Words, too garbled to understand. My scalp prickled, and I hung up before the message ended. That night, I didn't sleep. Every noise in the house felt louder, sharper. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, they all sounded wrong, like they weren't supposed to be there. The next morning, I did what any sane person would do. I called the number back. It rang once, twice. Then, "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." I called again. Same thing. I told myself it had to be some kind of fluke, a technical error. But I couldn't let it go. I went to the closet where I kept Dad's things, his old leather jacket, a shoebox of photos, and his phone. I'd kept it after he passed, a sentimental thing, even though it hadn't been used in years. When I turned it on, I felt a wave of relief. The battery was dead, completely drained. There was no way it could have made a call. But when I plugged it in to check, my stomach dropped. The call history was blank, as expected, except for one entry, a single outgoing call made the night before, at the exact time I'd gotten the call. I stared at the phone for what felt like an eternity. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped it. The screen clearly showed an outgoing call, his number, my number, and the timestamp to match. It didn't make sense. I tried to come up with some explanation. Maybe it was a glitch. Phones did weird things sometimes, right? I convinced myself it was some kind of technical hiccup. A random number was dialed, and somehow it aligned perfectly with my dad's old contact information. But the doubt lingered, gnawing at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. I powered off Dad's phone and shoved it back into the box. Out of sight, out of mind, that's what I told myself. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the feeling wouldn't go away. By the next day, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. I told myself I was tired, overworked, and that grief had a funny way of messing with your head, even years later. That night, I was halfway through making dinner when the phone rang again. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Slowly, I turned to look at the screen. Dad. My knees felt weak, and I had to grip the counter to steady myself. For a split second, I thought about ignoring it again. But something inside me, curiosity, fear, or maybe just sheer madness, made me answer this time. "Hello," I whispered. The static was back, louder now, crackling like a bad radio signal. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, straining to hear anything beyond the noise. And then I heard it. "Son." My blood turned to ice. The voice was faint, barely more than a whisper, but I recognized it. I would have known it anywhere. It was him. "Dad?" My voice cracked. "Is that you?" The static surged, drowning out whatever sound came next. I shouted into the phone, desperate. "Who is this? What do you want?" And then, just as suddenly as it started, the line went dead. I stared at the screen, my hand trembling so hard I nearly dropped the phone. My head spun with questions I couldn't answer. Was I losing my mind? Could it really have been him? I tried calling the number back, but it was the same as before. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service," no. That night, I didn't just double-check the locks. I barricaded the doors. I told myself it was because of some vague sense of unease, but deep down, I knew it was because I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The faint creak of the wooden floors, the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. I lay in bed with my phone clutched in my hand, waiting, dreading the moment it would ring again. It didn't, at least not that night, but something else happened. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the faint sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was a dream, some half-formed memory of my dad walking down the hall when I was a kid. But as I sat up, heart pounding, I realized the sound was coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed and crept to the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, every muscle in my body tense. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear any sign of movement. For a moment, everything was silent. Then a faint voice came from the other side of the door. "Son." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a call. It was just a statement. A single word spoken with a strange, hollow resonance that sent chills down my spine. I threw the door open, bat raised, ready to swing at whatever or whoever was out there. But the hallway was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the bat, my eyes scanning every shadow. I walked the length of the hall, flipping on every light as I went. Nothing. When I finally convinced myself there was no one there, I went back to bed, though I didn't sleep. I kept the lights on and the bat within reach. The next morning, I tried to rationalize it all. Maybe I'd been dreaming, half awake and imagining things. But then I saw the voicemail notification on my phone. Another message from Dad. I almost didn't listen to it. My finger hovered over the play button, my stomach twisting with dread, but curiosity won out. This time the static was clearer, louder. It seemed to pulse and thrum, almost like it was alive. And underneath it, I could hear the same faint whispering as before. But now I could make out words. "Help me!" My blood ran cold. "Who are you?" I shouted at the phone, as if the person on the other end could hear me. "What do you want from me?" The whispers stopped, and there was a long, deafening silence. Just as I was about to hang up, I heard it again. "Come home." I dropped the phone like it was on fire. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. Dad's house had been sold after he passed. I hadn't been back there in years. Why would I go back now? But the message stuck with me, gnawing at me. By the end of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to go. By the next morning, the idea of going back to Dad's house felt less like a choice and more like an obligation. The message, "Come home," echoed in my head, twisting itself into every thought. I knew it was insane, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see it for myself. I started by calling the family who had bought the house after Dad passed. They'd been friendly enough when we sold it, but I hadn't spoken to them since. The phone rang a few times before a woman answered, her voice polite but distant. "Hi, this is, this is a little strange, but I'm the previous owner of your house. I just had a question." I could almost hear her stiffen on the other end of the line. "Oh, okay. What's this about?" I hesitated. How was I supposed to explain this? "I know this sounds weird, but have you noticed anything unusual happening in the house? Like strange noises or—" "No," she said quickly, cutting me off. "Everything's been fine." Her voice was tight, too fast, like she was trying to get off the phone. I pressed on. "Are you sure? Nothing strange at all? Footsteps? Voices? Anything like that?" There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost a whisper. "We moved out 6 months ago." "What?" "We couldn't stay there anymore. My husband, he kept hearing things. Footsteps upstairs, voices calling his name. He thought it was just stress at first, but it got worse. One night he woke up screaming, said someone was standing at the foot of the bed." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Why didn't you say anything when you sold it?" "We didn't want to scare off buyers," she said almost apologetically. We needed to leave." The call ended shortly after that, but I didn't need to hear more. I was already packing a bag. Driving to Dad's house was surreal. The neighborhood looked the same as it had 3 years ago. Quiet, suburban, the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. The house itself, though, was different. The windows were dark, the yard overgrown, as if the house had been holding its breath since we left. The key was still under the loose brick by the front steps. I wasn't sure what I expected to find inside, but as I pushed open the door, I was hit with a wave of familiarity so strong it made my chest ache. The air was stale, thick with dust and something else, something faintly metallic, like blood. I wandered through the house slowly, each creak of the floorboards sending a jolt through me. Nothing had been touched. The new owners must have left in a hurry because most of the furniture was still there, covered in white sheets like forgotten ghosts. I stopped in the living room where Dad's old recliner still sat by the window. For a moment, I thought I could see him there, hunched over the crossword puzzle he always worked on, muttering under his breath. That's when I heard the static. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but as I turned toward the hallway, it grew louder. My phone was in my pocket, and when I pulled it out, the screen lit up. "Incoming call, Dad." My throat went dry. My thumb hovered over the answer button, but before I could press it, the call ended. And then, from somewhere upstairs, I heard the floorboards creak. The creak of the floorboards above me froze me in place. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding so loud I was sure whoever or whatever was up there could hear it. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, get in my car, and drive as far away as I could. But I didn't. Something held me there, something stronger than fear. "Dad," I called out, my voice shaking. Silence. Gripping my phone like a lifeline, I made my way to the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight, the sound echoing through the empty house. The upstairs hallway was darker than I remembered, the faint glow from my phone casting eerie shadows on the walls. The creaking sound came again, this time from Dad's old bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, just enough to show a sliver of darkness inside. "Who's there?" I said, louder this time. No response. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as I remembered it. The faded blue wallpaper, the bed with its neatly folded quilt, the nightstand with Dad's old alarm clock. Everything was untouched, frozen in time. And then I saw the phone. It was sitting on the nightstand, just where Dad used to keep it. His phone, the same one I'd taken after he passed, the one I had locked away in my closet at home. My stomach churned. Slowly, I reached for it. The moment my fingers touched the cold plastic, the screen lit up. One new voicemail. I didn't press play. Not yet. Instead, I turned the phone over, examining it. It was identical to the one I'd brought home, down to the crack in the corner of the screen. I turned it on, half expecting it to be dead, but it powered up instantly. The battery was at 100%. I couldn't ignore the voicemail anymore. My hands trembled as I brought the phone to my ear and pressed play. At first it was the same static as before, hissing and crackling like an old radio, but then the voice came through. "Son." I felt my knees go weak. It was his voice again, clearer this time, more distinct. "I need you to listen to me." The static surged, drowning out the words for a moment before his voice returned. "I didn't mean to leave it unfinished. I didn't mean to—" The message cut off abruptly, leaving nothing but silence. "What didn't you mean to do?" I shouted into the empty room, my voice cracking. "What's unfinished?" I didn't expect an answer. I certainly didn't expect the phone in my hand to ring again. But it did. Incoming call. "Dad." This time I answered immediately. "What do you want from me?" The line was silent for a moment, and then his voice came through low and distorted. "Check the basement." The line went dead. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. I didn't want to go down there. I didn't even want to be in the house anymore. But deep down, I knew I didn't have a choice. Something was waiting for me in the basement. Something significant happens that raises the stakes and accelerates the tension. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, staring down into the pitch-black void. The air was heavier here, colder, carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded me of rust or blood. I didn't want to do this. Every nerve in my body screamed to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But that voice, Dad's voice, echoed in my mind. "Check the basement." I flicked on the light switch by the door. Nothing happened. Of course. Using my phone's flashlight, I descended the stairs one step at a time, each creak of the old wooden steps magnified in the oppressive silence. The light from my phone was weak, barely cutting through the darkness, but it was enough to show me the basement's outline. Concrete walls, a few rusted shelves, and Dad's old workbench in the corner. As I reached the bottom, I noticed something odd. The floor wasn't as dusty as I expected. There were faint trails in the dirt, like something or someone had been moving down here recently. "Dad?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. I swept the flashlight across the room, my heart racing. My eyes caught on something in the far corner, a section of the wall that looked different. The concrete there was cleaner, newer, as though it had been patched recently. I walked over, the flashlight shaking in my hand. When I got closer, I saw that the edges of the patch weren't smooth. They were uneven, like someone had rushed to seal something up. My stomach twisted. On the workbench, I spotted a small sledgehammer and a chisel. Without thinking, I grabbed them. My hands were slick with sweat as I positioned the chisel against the wall and swung the hammer. The sound echoed in the small space, deafening. I hit it again and again. Each blow sent chunks of concrete crumbling to the floor, revealing a hollow space behind the wall. After what felt like an eternity, the opening was wide enough to see through. I shone my flashlight inside and froze. It was a small, dark cavity, just big enough for a person, and inside I saw a figure slumped against the wall, wrapped in tattered clothing. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. The body was skeletal, the skin dry and stretched tight over the bones. But there was something unmistakable about the face, even in its decayed state. It was my father. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My father was dead. I'd buried him. I'd seen him in the casket. So how was he here? As I stared at the body, a sound broke the silence, a faint, wheezing breath. My blood turned to ice. The corpse's chest moved, rising and falling in shallow, ragged intervals. "Son," it whispered, the voice faint and distorted. I backed away, tripping over my own feet. My father, his body, lurched forward, the hollow sockets of his eyes locking onto mine. Why didn't you help me? It rasped. I, I don't understand, I stammered. You left me here. The words hit me like a physical blow. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. No, I didn't. I didn't know. The thing that had once been my father began to crawl toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. The air grew colder with every inch it closed between us. You let me die, it hissed, and now you'll join me. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the stairs, my breath coming in panicked gasps. Behind me, I could hear the scraping sound of bones dragging across the concrete. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached the top of the stairs. I slammed the basement door shut and threw the bolt across, as if that thin piece of wood could stop whatever was crawling up from the darkness below. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. My mind raced, a chaotic jumble of panic and disbelief. What I'd seen, what I'd heard couldn't be real. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, the memory of that decayed, moving figure burned itself deeper into my mind. And then the pounding started. The door rattled on its hinges as something heavy slammed against it from the other side. I jumped back, my eyes locked on the doorknob, which began to twist slowly, deliberately. Son, the voice rasped from the other side. It was louder now, clearer. It was Dad's voice, but not entirely. There was something wrong with it, something cold and inhuman. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a chair, and jammed it under the doorknob, reinforcing the bolt. The pounding continued, each blow shaking the frame. Why didn't you save me? It hissed. Tears streamed down my face as I stumbled back, shaking my head. You're not him. You're not my dad. The pounding stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. I held my breath, waiting, dreading what would come next. And then the whispers began. They came from everywhere and nowhere, low and insidious, slithering into my ears like they were crawling straight into my brain. I couldn't make out the words, but they carried a terrible weight, an accusation that filled me with shame and fear. The air grew colder, heavy with the metallic tang I'd smelled in the basement. My breath fogged in front of me, and the lights in the house began to flicker. And then I heard it, a faint dragging sound, like something moving across the floor. But it wasn't coming from the basement anymore. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway was empty, but the dragging sound continued, growing louder, closer. I backed away, clutching the chair like a weapon, my eyes darting to every shadow. Son, the voice called again, impossibly close now. The air in front of me shimmered, bending like heat waves on asphalt, and then slowly something began to take shape. It was Dad, but not as I remembered him. His face was twisted, his skin pallid and sunken, his eyes black pits that seemed to swallow the light. His body was broken, his limbs bent at unnatural angles, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. You left me to rot, he said, his voice layered with something darker, deeper. Now it's your turn. I swung the chair, but it passed through him like smoke. He laughed, a horrible grating sound that made my skin crawl. You can't run from this, he said. You can't run from me. The room around me began to shift, the walls twisting and warping like they were alive. Shadows crept across the floor, crawling up my legs, pulling me down. I screamed, struggling against the invisible force, but it was no use. The last thing I saw before everything went black was his face, inches from mine, whispering a single, chilling word, stay. When I came to, the air was thick and suffocating, heavy with that metallic tang of rust and decay. I wasn't in the house anymore, or if I was, it had transformed into something unrecognizable. The walls were no longer plaster and wood, but pulsing, organic surfaces that oozed a dark, viscous liquid. The floor beneath me was soft and damp, like flesh. The faint glow from some unseen source bathed everything in a sickly reddish light. I tried to move, but my limbs were sluggish. like they were weighed down by something unseen. The whispers were back, louder now, overlapping into a maddening cacophony that filled my head. "Dad?" I called out weakly. The whispers stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard the dragging sound again, coming from somewhere behind me. My stomach twisted into knots as I turned to look. He was there. Or it was. The thing that wore my father's face was crawling toward me, its broken limbs jutting out at impossible angles. Its black, empty eyes locked onto mine. The grin on its face stretched wider, splitting the skin at the corners of its mouth. "You left me," it said, its voice a guttural snarl. "You let me suffer. You forgot me." "No," I shouted, forcing myself to my feet. "That's not true. I didn't know. I didn't." "You knew," it roared, its voice shaking the walls. "You always knew. You just didn't want to see." The floor beneath me shifted, rising and falling like the surface of a breathing creature. I stumbled, nearly falling as the thing lunged at me. I scrambled backward, my hands sinking into the pulsing, wet surface of the floor. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "If you're really him, tell me what to do. Tell me how to fix this." It stopped, tilting its head as if considering my words. For a moment, I thought I saw something human in its expression. A flicker of the man who used to read me bedtime stories, who used to cheer me on at baseball games. "Take my place," it whispered. "What?" "You can fix it," it said, its voice soft and coaxing now. "You can make it right. Just stay. Stay here, and I can be free." The walls around me pulsed, the whispers returning in a low, rhythmic chant. "Stay, stay, stay." "No," I said, shaking my head. "There has to be another way." "There's no other way," it said, its voice hardening. "You owe me this." Before I could respond, the ground beneath me opened up. I screamed as I fell into the darkness, the air around me filled with the sound of his laughter. When I woke up, I was lying on the living room floor of Dad's house. The sun was streaming through the windows, filling the room with warm, golden light. It was quiet, eerily so. No whispers, no creaking floorboards, no dragging sounds. Just silence. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. A vivid, horrifying nightmare born out of grief and too many sleepless nights. But then I saw the marks on my hands. Dark, sticky streaks of the same viscous substance I'd seen in that warped, pulsing space. I sat up slowly, my body aching as though I'd been through a marathon. The chair I jammed under the basement door was still there, but the door itself was open. The bolt had been slid back, and the faint smell of decay wafted up from below. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But I had to. With shaky legs, I made my way to the basement stairs. The light switch still didn't work, so I used my phone's flashlight again. The beam was weak, flickering, but it was enough to show me the jagged hole in the far wall. The cavity was empty. My stomach churned as I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wanted to leave the house, to run as far as I could, but something stopped me. The phone. It was lying on the kitchen counter, the same phone I'd found in Dad's room. It shouldn't have been there. I hadn't touched it since I dropped it in the basement, but there it was, the screen glowing faintly. One new voicemail. I stared at it, my hands trembling. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to know, but some part of me, some small, desperate part, hoped it might hold an answer, an explanation, something to make sense of the madness. I picked up the phone and pressed play. At first there was static. Then came the voice. "Thank you," it said. It was Dad's voice, but it was different this time. Softer, calmer, almost peaceful. "You set me free." Tears welled in my eyes as I listened. "Dad," I whispered. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean for you to find me. I didn't mean for you to suffer. But it's over now. You don't have to worry anymore." The static surged, louder now, drowning out his voice. And then just before the message ended, I heard one last faint whisper. Don't go back. The phone went dark in my hand. I didn't wait. I didn't pack. I didn't even lock the door behind me. I just got in my car and drove, leaving the house, and whatever was still in it, behind. That was 6 months ago. I sold the house to the first buyer who made an offer. I didn't ask questions, and I didn't stick around for the paperwork. I haven't gone back, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world feels still, I hear it, the static. It creeps in like a whisper, faint and insidious, crawling through the walls of my mind. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I swear I hear his voice. Come home.